That is a really critical minute where, I mean, if you lose dual engine power at this critical phase of flight, you're screwed. There's nothing, you do not have the altitude to glide back to your destination.
Kevin is very talented, but I don't know if it's going to be him, but he's a very talented guy.
Hey, it's Kevin. So I've been watching this Captain Steeeve video on fuel filter failures and contaminated fuel. And he talks a lot about airindia 171, potentially borrowing off of the crisis of airindia 171, suggesting that maybe a fuel filter contamination was the problem in the crash that caused the airindia 171 crash shortly after takeoff. There have been a lot of theories circulating around this, but I want to talk a little bit about fuel filters and fuel contamination and some issues that there might be with Captain Steeve's video. But first, I want to also shout out here Gary B. Pilot, who talks about how we go into sort of some casework documentation into how previous engine thrust failures have been suspected by the NTSB in 787 aircraft, where the thrust control malfunction accommodation can instruct the FADEC to potentially revert thrust in engines to go to an idle setting. I would argue that at the moment, this software glitch is potentially the highest likelihood, though probably still only 20-30%, because there's so many different things that could have happened with the airindia 171 crash. It seems to be that some form of software FADEC, dual FADEC issue, which is remarkable since each engine has its own, but some kind of central electronic computing system failure that sent the thrust for both engines to idle that led to that tragic 171 airindia crash. Now, regarding airindia 315, which I made a video about a week or so ago, we have Captain Steeeve just now breaking down airindia 315, and what he does is he sets up the scene as, hey, here's a case where we had pilots on airindia 315 make what he calls the right decision to divert back to Hong Kong on their way to Delhi, given a potential fuel filter error. You can listen to that here.
Okay. Technical reasons, sir, would like to stay closer to Hong Kong. Maybe we will come back and land back into Hong Kong once we sort out the problem. We don't want to continue further.
Okay, airindia.
And so there's some speculation now that much like that airindia 315 crash, complaining about a fuel filter issue or some form of engine-related fuel flow issue that's coming up on their screens, this is an aircraft that basically didn't end up in the disaster that airindia 171 ended in because they diverted. Now, is that possible on an immediate takeoff? No, of course. But what you end up having is Captain Steeeve suggests that, hey, you know, here are the checklists. If you have one engine fuel filter message, you'll just monitor the performance, although you could end up getting a flame out. If you end up having a dual engine fuel filter error, then land at the nearest suitable airport. So he provides the checklist for what would normally be done in a Boeing 787. Now, what I noticed, and this is what my impression was when I first watched the Captain Steeeve video, is very often when we get failure notifications on either fuel pumps or fuel filter lines, not always, but they tend to be sensor issues. Now, the reason I mention sensor issues, and here's a comment that brings this up, is because I don't believe that one of these fuel issues is a high likelihood, unless there was some bizarre combination of sudden fuel flow shut off along with vapor lock and some kind of cascading electrical problem that would have contributed to the airindia 171 crash, mostly because I agree with this poster here that a lot of fuel filter errors seem to be related to crappy sensors. Now, that doesn't mean don't land or don't pay attention to the issue, and I'll give you a personal experience with this, but take a look at this comment. I'm an A&P mechanic. I work on commercial jetliners. We get calls on fuel filter bypass lights, and most of the time it's an indication issue, not an actually clogged filter. Now, keep in mind, there were no other reports of aircraft receiving fuel filter issues or having engine issues because of contaminated fuel coming out of the Air India 171 airport or 315 airport. So in neither of those cases have there been reports of other aircraft having issues of fuel contamination, because fuel contamination is relatively a rare occurrence. Now, it has happened before. Take a look at Cathay Pacific. This was a remarkable case where nobody actually died despite the aircraft landing at twice its normal speed back in 2010, popping, I think it was 7 out of almost all of their tires. But nobody died despite landing at twice its normal speed, blowing a lot of tires, and remarkably surviving this contaminated fuel incident that damaged both of the aircraft's engines. This was 2010. If we go back to the Dominican Airlines Flight 603, this is 1970. So 40 years earlier, we get a water contamination issue in the fuel lines. 1960, we get the Munich C-130 crash because of water freezing at the bottom of the fuel inlet tanks. And then we have a 2012 short-haul flight where about three of the four occupants were killed, also potentially due to fuel contamination caused by rain that led to contamination. So in the last, what do we have here, 65 years, we've had 4 incidents of fuel contamination. This is really, really low. This is very, very rare to have a fuel contamination-related crash, let alone then a fatal crash. So for the fatalities associated with fuel contamination, very, very low. In fact, if you look at some of the FAA's documentation or their advisory circulars on fuel failures, most of the fuel failures issues that they will talk about will only have to do with piston engines or reciprocating engine aircraft. The reason they do is because this is where fuel contamination becomes even more important. And what I find remarkable is they pin the biggest cause of fuel problems on piston aircraft on fuel starvation. In other words, pilots not properly monitoring how much fuel they have in each tank, especially since a lot of older planes or even Pipers still today will require that you manually change from the left tank to the right tank every about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on what power setting you're flying. I had to do this in my training as well. It's exhausting and it's really important to pay attention to. But the FAA suggests that 51% of all engine power loss accidents are related to fuel exhaustion. So a lot of cases where you have aircraft failing or crashing because of an engine failure is often more than half of the time related to the pilot's failure to pay attention to how much fuel they actually have or should have. Potentially loading too little fuel, not properly calculating an alternate airport if they're entering IMC conditions, or potentially need to fly to a different airport for whatever reason. They also talk about the potential for a lack of training around sumping fuel out of piston aircraft, where generally you'll take these little sump cups, and on Cessnas, I don't know, you've got like 7 or 8 different spots you have to check. On a Cirrus, you might have 3 different spots that you check, usually 1 under each wing and 1 center tank. What I found that was very fascinating when I went to jet training school and started flying a jet was that it's actually not recommended to sump the fuel on these. Now, they actually do have fuel sumps under the aircraft, under the fuselage and under the wings and the low points of the tanks, but they actually don't recommend you sump them because they're such larger sumps. There have been plenty of cases, this is what I'm told from, every single pilot I've ever flown with, they're like, no, we don't touch those. Apparently the sumps get stuck. So if you go sump the fuel to see if there's water contamination or debris or whatever in the fuel on a jet, there's a high likelihood of that sump staying in the stuck open position and then dumping thousands of pounds of fuel onto the tarmac before you can stop the flow. And now you're talking about thousands of dollars of fuel in the ground, but also a fire safety hazard issue. So kind of odd because the manuals for jet aircraft do call for sumping the fuel, but nobody in practice seems to do it. And I've never seen any jet pilot actually sump fuel. But then again, maybe that is something that should be done unless there isn't an actual fuel contamination issue in aircraft, especially modern aircraft, where maybe what we actually have is just a sensing issue. So I kind of agree with this comment here that it's possible we might just be looking at sensing issues in terms of why the 315 pilots decided to turn back in an abundance of caution. And this is where I'd actually like to point out my own fuel sensor issues that I've had on my very own plane. So on our Phenom 300E, we have had a fuel valve fail on our left engine show up. This basically means we're now operating without the powered fuel pump, and we're just operating on essentially the sump. And then, of course, the other engine has its active DC-powered fuel pump plus the sump. And so we've seen this before where we would actually then switch, follow our checklist and switch our pump from auto to on. We'd see the failure, we'd turn it, to off, and the failure light goes away, but then again, our pump is off. And so we'd go through our troubleshooting steps, never lost any engine thrust, never any issues with the engine, all engine vitals, so to speak, completely normal. And so, of course, we stopped flying, called in service. Service ended up ordering from Embraer a fuel pump replacement for the left side. And the crazy thing, I didn't know why they did this. I think it's probably the safer way to do it. They replaced the pump out of an abundance of caution, and then just to test, they moved the fuel sensor, the fuel pump sensor, from the left engine to the right engine. The next time I go flying, I get right fuel sensor fail, so fuel valve fail. And we're like, all right, it's the sensor at this point. Engines are operating normally. The right pump never had an issue. The left pump is brand new. The sensor's obviously gone. Very next flight, that sensor was replaced. I'm not sure why they even kept it in the first place, but that was a maintenance decision. But it's interesting because I've personally had that experience on a 2021 jet. So I don't think it's highly uncommon for these sensors to go, and it sort of aligns with what I'm seeing in the comment here, though there could be a little bit of confirmation bias involved in that. That said, there's also a note where somebody leaves a comment here, a clarification, which Steeeve rightfully pins, and says that fuel on the 787 is fed on takeoff by the left-hand engine tank and the right-hand engine tank independently during takeoff. There was some commentary that maybe they're both fuel fed from the center tank on the 787. This individual suggests, and it was pinned by Captain Steeeve, that they would individually be fed from each engine, which again suggests contaminated fuel would not necessarily cause Air India 171 to crash immediately after takeoff, because if you go to the more recent Cathay Air flight, and you study this, there are plenty of great YouTube videos on Cathay Pacific Flight 780, you actually find that the engines didn't both fail together at the same time, which is very unusual. They actually flamed out individually, and the second engine sputtered out over time. And so this gave the flight crew an opportunity to divert, emergency land at another airport, which is great. But it indicates that usually if you're starting to get fuel contamination issues, the issues would show up at the engines at different times and not at exactly the same time. Which brings us back to this idea, much like Gary B. Pilot over here suggests, that, hey, maybe there's some kind of software glitch that ultimately reset the FADEX on Air India 171 to some form of reversionary mode to an idle thrust setting, and there was not enough time to go through a checklist to essentially clear this issue before crashing. Now, I will say, any pilot that I have flown with has asked me, they're like, Kevin, what are your thoughts on the Air India 171 crash? Like, everybody's talking about Air India 171 in the aviation community because, frankly, it's scary. I love flying. I try to go flying almost every single week, and I think pilots regularly do. I don't fly for anyone but myself. Some people fly professionally 3-4 times a week. I mean, sometimes I'm flying for myself 3-4 times a week. But more so, the point is, it's scary. And pilots themselves are wondering, here's some sort of footage in the background of us, for example, going to take off. And this is such a scary moment when you're going to take off that it's odd to think, gosh, what if we lost both engines in this moment? There's not much you can do other than basically hope that you've got a field in front of you, which is really scary. You can take a look at my takeoff here.
Rio Tower, Cherokee 2897, Mike, holding shell runway 26 on Alpha.
Cherokee 2897,
All right, 26, heading's good. Ready?
Yes,
sir, let's do it. Okay, power set.
97, Mike.
ATR's in the green. Yep, disregard.
See that yellow pop-up right there? That's the FMS disagree. That's what it looks like when a CAS message or an error code shows up. That would be the same thing as like fuel filter fault or fuel valve fault or whatever. In this case, it's FMS disagree. And we actually prepare for this in our brief before we go to take off. We're like, if we get an FMS disagree because this plane does it a lot, we will disregard it. So we're generally prepared for that. And it's usually, if there's a long line, there were like 4 or 5 planes in front of us to taxi out here and take off. Usually if we're like on the ground running for more than 10 minutes, the fuel sync is slightly off and we get that error message. So it's very common after the power is set. It's the most annoying thing in this aircraft.
Okay, brakes off. All right, there's speed alive 3 ways. 70? Sure. See that helicopter coming over? That's what I was worried about. Hey, V1, rotate. The helicopter's no factor. V2. Positive rate. Positive rate. You're up. Go. We got that helicopter in sight, no factor. I'm going to start turning left though.
Helicopter 605 north, back with the option report on the go east time.
Okay, flap up.
The option north pad, 605 better.
Cherokee 97, Mike, right down approved, runway 26, clear for takeoff, caution wake turbines for the departed Pino.
Runway 26.
Traffic.
Right down approved.
Yeah, you're clear. No factor.
Clear with the takeoff, 9SM, Mike.
Okay, AP set on heading.
Pino 4 Papa Papa, contact point, make a departure.
Contacting departure, 4 Papa, thank you. Oops. Departure. Alright, call one. Departure, Phenom 694 Papa Papa at 1600, climbing 3000.
Number 694 Papa Papa, radar contact, climb maintain 4000.
Climb maintain 4000, 694 Papa Papa, thank you. Alright, landing gear is up.
4 Papa Papa, contact Magoo approach 128. Back hold.
Shit. That's gonna be 2865, right? 12865, 694 Papa Papa, thank you.
All right. Here you go. So, like, your goal on a takeoff, I mean, we're at 2,700 feet here, right? Your goal on a takeoff is how quickly can I get up? You know, on a jet, you know, we're moving fast. We're going, you know, we're already, what was that, 30 seconds, and we're already at 3,000 feet. I mean, let's calculate maybe a little bit longer. So there's our rotation. There we go. We rotate at 148. And to get to 3,000 feet, I think we're about 50 seconds or so. 2,500 there. Yeah, it's about a minute. It's about a minute. So that is a really critical minute. Where, I mean, if you lose dual engine power at this critical phase of flight, you're screwed. There's nothing, you do not have the altitude to glide back to your destination, let alone have the time to go through, you know, checklists or some sort of diagnosis on the issue. So this is quite a challenging moment for pilots, and that's why it's so alarming and heartbreaking to see what happened with the airindia 171 crash. But it also makes us wonder, like, would it be fuel contamination? Well, no other aircraft seem to have the problem. Would it be, you know, some kind of software glitch? That would be very scary because even our throttle is computer controlled. You know, I could steer up, down, left, right, like my ailerons, my, you know, my pitch and my rudders. I could steer this by hand in this particular aircraft. In a Boeing, you would have a steer-by-wire system. This one, I'm actually like inputting the controls myself, but not on my throttle. My throttle is a computer as well, much like the airindia 787-8 Boeing, where you're really just sending a computer signal. So it's kind of like, imagine you get like a blue screen of death. I mean, gosh, quite literally, that's a little morbid. But you get a blue screen of death or whatever on software. That's terrible. This was more footage of sort of us landing, which we can talk about in a different video. But yeah, something to pay attention to, and hopefully we find out what else is going on with the Air India 171 crash.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.